Welcome to Rges World Literature. This is Lesson 12, and we'll be discussing Shakespeare's life. I do want to encourage you to take some simple notes that will record the basic facts. I'll be giving you some hints by writing some of that, maybe not all of that, on the whiteboard here. Now, I will be taking this from an article that's included in the Folger Shakespeare Library books. I'm going to go ahead and basically just read it, filling in some details and explanations as I go. Surviving documents that give us glimpses into the life of William Shakespeare show us a playwright, poet, and actor who grew up in the market town of Stratford-upon-Avon, spent his professional life in London, and returned to Stratford a wealthy landowner. He was born in April of 1564, died in April of 1616, so he was 62 years old, and is buried inside the chancel of Holy Trinity Church in Stratford. Continuing on, we wish we could know more about the life of the world's greatest dramatist. His plays and poems are testaments to his wide reading, especially to his knowledge of Virgil, Ovid, Plutarch, Holinshed's Chronicles, and the Bible, and to his mastery of the English language, but we can only speculate about his education. We know that the King's New School in Stratford-upon-Avon was considered excellent. The school was one of the English grammar schools, established to educate young men primarily in Latin, grammar, and literature. As in other schools of the time, students began their studies at the age of 4 or 5 in the attached Petty School, and there learned to read and write in English, studying primarily the Catechism from the Book of Common Prayer. After 2 years in the Petty School, students entered the lower form or grade of the grammar school, where they begin the serious study of Latin grammar and Latin texts that would occupy most of the remainder of their school days. Several Latin texts that Shakespeare used repeatedly in writing his plays and poems were texts that schoolboys memorized and recited. Latin comedies were introduced early in the lower form. In the upper form, which the boys entered at age 10 or 11, students wrote their own Latin orations and declamations, studied Latin histories and rhetoricians, that would be public speakers, and began the study of Greek using the Greek New Testament. Since the records of the Stratford Grammar School do not survive, we cannot prove that William Shakespeare attended the school. However, every indication, his father's position as an alderman and bailiff of Stratford, the playwright's own knowledge of the Latin classics, scenes in the plays that recall grammar school experiences, for example, The Merry Wives of Windsor, suggests that he did. We also lack generally accepted documentation about Shakespeare's life after his schooling ended and his professional life in London began. His marriage in 1582, at age 18 to Anne Hathaway, and the subsequent births of his daughter Susanna in 1583 and the twins Judith and Hamnet in 1585 are recorded, but how he supported himself and where he lived are not known. Nor do we know when and where he left Stratford for the London theatrical world, nor how he rose to be the important figure in that world that he had become by the early 1590s. Now that would put his age at this time that we're discussing before 30 years old. So by the time he was 30, he was well established in London as an actor and probably also a writer. So we'll be discussing that a little bit more. Let me throw some notes here for you on the board. We do know that by 1592, he had achieved some prominence in London as both an actor and a playwright. In that year, was published a book by the playwright Robert Greene attacking an actor who had the audacity to write blank verse drama and who was, in his own conceit, quote, in his own conceit, or conceit means opinion, the only shake scene in the country, unquote. Since Greene's attack includes a parody of a line from one of Shakespeare's early plays, there is little doubt that it is Shakespeare to whom he refers. A shake scene who had aroused Greene's fury by successfully competing with university-educated dramatists like Greene himself. So he was drawing jealousy even by as early as 1592 from his peers. It was in 1593 that Shakespeare became a published poet. In that year, he published his long narrative poem, Venus and Adonis, and in 1594 he followed it with the Rape of Lucrece. Both poems were dedicated to the young Earl of Southampton, Henry Wriothesley, who may have become Shakespeare's patron. I was going to explain that it is not untypical for writers and poets to have a wealthy patron who paid them as they produced their writings. And so often a dedication to somebody indicated that that was the person basically who flipped the bill for their efforts while they were writing. Continuing on with the text, it seems no coincidence that Shakespeare wrote these narrative poems at a time when the theaters were closed because of the plague, a contagious epidemic disease that devastated the population of London. When the theaters were reopened in 1594, Shakespeare apparently resumed his double career of actor and playwright and began his long and seemingly profitable service as an acting company shareholder. That means that he would invest some of his money and then reap the profits on each performance. Records for December of 1594 show him to be a leading member of the Lord Chamberlain's men. It was this company of actors, later named the King's Men, for whom he would be a principal actor, dramatist, and shareholder for the rest of his career. Continuing on, so far as we can tell, that career spanned about 20 years. In the 1590s, he wrote his plays on English history, as well as several comedies and at least 2 tragedies, Titus Andronicus and Romeo and Juliet. These histories, comedies, and tragedies are the plays credited to him in 1598 in a work, Pilatus Tamia, that in one chapter compares English writers with, quote, Greek, Latin, and Italian poets, unquote. There, the author, Francis Mears, claims that Shakespeare is comparable to the Latin dramatists Seneca for tragedy and Plautus for comedy, and calls him the, quote, most excellent in both kinds for the stage. So this is pretty high praise, and he's receiving this before 1600. He also names him, quote unquote, mellifluous and honey-tongued Shakespeare. Quote again from Mears, I say that the muses would speak with Shakespeare's fine-filed phrase if they would speak English. Period. So again, he's receiving great praise at this stage of his career. Since Mears also mentions Shakespeare's, quote, sugared sonnets among his private friends, unquote, it is assumed that many of Shakespeare's sonnets, which were not published until as a collection until 1609, were already written in the 1590s. In 1599, Shakespeare's company built a theater for themselves across the river from London, naming it the Globe. The plays that are considered by many to be Shakespeare's major tragedies, Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, and Macbeth were written while the company was resident in this theater, as were such comedies as Twelfth Night and Measure for Measure. Many of Shakespeare's plays were performed at court, both for Queen Elizabeth I and after her death in 1603 for King James I. Some were presented at the Inns of Court, the residences of London's legal societies, and some were doubtless performed in other towns, at the universities and at great houses when the king's men went on tour. Otherwise, his plays from 1599 to 1608 were, so far as we know, performed only at the Globe. Between 1608 and 1612, Shakespeare wrote several plays, among them The Winter's Tale and The Tempest, presumably for the company's new indoor Blackfriars Theatre, though the plays seem to have been performed also at the Globe and at court. Surviving documents describe a performance of The Winter's Tale in 1611 at the Globe, for example, and performances of The Tempest in 1611 and 1613 at the Royal Palace of Whitehall. So I think it's becoming obvious to you, not only was he a very prolific writer of dramas, but he was also a very famous man in his own day, considered probably even before his death one of the greatest authors in England of the time. Continuing on, Shakespeare wrote very little after 1612, the year in which he probably wrote King Henry VIII. It was at a performance of King Henry VIII in 1613 that the Globe caught fire and burned to the ground. Sometime between 1610 and 1613, he seems to have returned to live in Stratford-upon-Avon, where he owned a large house and considerable property, and where his wife and his 2 daughters and their husbands lived. His son Hamnet had died in 1596, when the boy was only 11 years old. During his professional years in London, Shakespeare had presumably derived income from the acting company's profits, as well as from his own career as an actor, from the sale of his play manuscripts to the acting company, and after 1599 from his shares as an owner of the Globe. It was presumably that income, carefully invested in land and other property, which made him the wealthy man that surviving documents show him to have become. It is also assumed that William Shakespeare's growing wealth and reputation played some part in inclining the crown in 1596 to grant John Shakespeare, William's father, the coat of arms that he had so long sought. William Shakespeare died in Stratford on April 23, 1616, according to the epitaph carved under his bust in Holy Trinity Church, and was buried on April 25th. 7 years after his death, his collected plays were published as Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies, this work now known as the First Folio. So to conclude, Shakespeare was a very famous man, of course, very incredibly talented man, prolific writer of drama, well-known actor, and very wealthy for his time. He would have been considered a strongly successful man in not only his own community of Stratford-on-Avon, but also in London, and known, probably, not exaggeration to say, well-known throughout England by the time of his death. So go ahead and put these in your notes and study them, and we will see you next time.